The Nightmare on Elm Street series is one of the most iconic and long-lasting horror series in film history. Its effects and influences are felt far and wide, and it made Freddy Krueger a virtual institution of horror archetype. Unfortunately, many of the Nightmare sequels seem to forget the cathartic power of Freddy Krueger's influence, and devolve the character into a lowbrow comedic punchline. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I enjoy Freddy's comedic antics as much as the next person. Part of why Freddy's later comedic turns work so well is because of Robert Englund. He brought in undeniable gravitas and sarcastic wit, and his relish in playing the role naturally lent itself to the comedic edge the later sequels adopted. But I think Wes Craven's original intentions for Freddy Krueger were far more nuanced than the sequels were interested in. I feel that Part 3 was the only sequel in the series that paid the respect and reverence Craven's creation deserved. The movie elevated the series' B-movie tendencies and gave them an A-movie polish. Much of this is accomplished by the top-tier direction of Chuck Russell and the fantastic script by Russell and Frank Darabont, who wrote the final drafts, from Wes Craven and Bruce Wagner's original scripts. Interestingly enough, Craven's idea for New Nightmare, the later film in the series that would serve as a kind of thematic epilogue of his intentions, were first pondered for Nightmare 3. Craven's original idea for the third film was of the actors filming a New Nightmare sequel to be haunted by the iconic boogeyman, but New Line Cinema rejected the idea. 1987 was a little too early for meta takes on genre, and Craven went off to film Deadly Friend instead. In fact, the journey of the script for Nightmare 3 would take all sorts of twists and turns. At one point, John Saxon, who played Nancy's father, would write his own prequel script entitled How the Nightmare on Elm Street Began, which would posit that Freddy was actually innocent of the crimes for which he was well known for, the murders having instead been committed by Charles Manson and his cultist followers. Even Robert Englund would take a stab, pun intended, at a script. His version would see Tina Gray's sister return to Elm Street to investigate her murder, with Freddy setting booby traps in the Elm Street house. This would later become the basis for the pilot episode of Freddy's Nightmares, the short-lived TV series that tried to capitalize on the success of the horror genre's most lovable villain. Much of the entrails for the eventual movie came from Wes Craven and Bruce Wagner's original drafts, with most of the characters being created in those initial stages, only with altered details throughout. For instance, Nancy did not work in the mental health field. Taryn was black. Joey was the one who built the papier-mâché house. Philip was a 13-year-old, and on and on. As it turns out, details are everything in a movie, and director Chuck Russell, along with his co-writer Frank Darabont, who knew a little bit about how to create characters and stories that resonate, took Craven and Wagner's very dark and humorless script and turned it into a fun, hellish carnival thrill ride that had the pathos and psychological nuances that the movie would become known for. Freddy Krueger as a horror movie villain was the perfect stand-in for the anxieties and nightmares of teenagers who are grappling with the frightening realities of potential adulthood. As such, Freddy could be seen as representing the harsh realities of life. One of these harsh realities is the idea of broken dreams, people who imagined idealized lives for themselves, but were forced to cope with an uncaring world, which seemed to actively work against them in achieving those dreams. And in Nightmare 3, this idea of broken dreams seems to extend all the way to the American dream itself. The American dream is about equality of opportunity, the ability of anyone, from any walk of life, from any circumstance, to create the ideal life for themselves. If you're chuckling, I don't blame you. Was this ever true? Even in the 1950s, when America was at peak idealism, this so-called American dream only seemed relevant for a certain chunk of the population, while others seemed left out in the cold. And in later years, especially leading into the 1980s, it became less and less true for more and more people. The American dream, with its white picket fences and nuclear families, was at the heart of the Elm Street series, and Nancy Thompson's house could be thought of as representative of this. The safe, predictable, comforting structure that is the foundation of American life. It is the core of any person's well-being and ability to function and grow in the world. During Part 3's opening credits, Kristen is constructing a physical replica of this house, which she witnessed from her dream. In Kristen's dream, the house is dilapidated, basically falling apart. And when she's awake, her attempts to reconstruct this house and restore it to its former glory as the all-American symbol it resembled in the first movie acts as a thematic statement. The all-American dream that was basically ripped to shreds by Kruger. If Kruger is the force that threatens this idealistic existence, then he could be thought of as the ugly underbelly of American society. The trash people try to desperately get rid of, but not without getting their own hands dirty. The parents themselves are what set the entire nightmare in motion to begin with. The dream monster Freddy was just the inevitable fallout, representing the sins of the Elm Street parents. The characters in Nightmare 3 are one of the film's most impressive standouts, and something that made it so memorable. They are all not only distinct from one another, but seem to share a chemistry and bond that made many of their later deaths so disturbing. These characters also perfectly encapsulate this idea of broken dreams, and dealing with Freddy as a stand-in for the harsh realities of adulthood. Most of these characters are suffering from different aspects of a kind of shattered idealism. Let's start with Kincaid, because I think his presence is the most socially relevant. Kincaid is somewhat of the stereotypical angry black man, but he has a charm and sweetness that betrays this attitude. Black men have a particularly troubled history with American institutions, most notably prison. The psych ward the characters are confined to could be thought of as a type of prison, since none of them are allowed to leave. And Kincaid's aggressive outbursts could be construed as his attempts to fight against this institutional trap many of his kind fall into. The harsh reality of being a black adult male seems to tie into this idea, and it's interesting that Kincaid is one of the few who survived the movie, as we all know the track record for blacks in horror movies, and Kincaid's power is one of strength, which is a nice contrast to his predicament. If the Nightmare on Elm Street series up to this point has been about suburban teens in a safe, comfortable bubble having that bubble burst by Freddy, Nightmare 3 is an escalation of this. By having these teenagers vulnerable on both sides of the aisle, they not only have Freddy to contend with, but also an apathetic, ignorant institutional structure that wants to sedate them into compliance. The dream powers of the Elm Street kids is one of the more innovative ideas to introduce itself into the Nightmare series. It was a cool way for the characters to have a fighting chance against Freddy, and it allowed for some pretty trippy dream sequences. The character of Kristen, who is basically the movie's focus, has the ability to pull people into her dreams. This ability puts Kristen at the forefront of the film's thematic intentions. She has a typical all-American girl-next-door look. This ties into the American dream angle that was hinted at in the opening sequences, with the construction of the Elm Street house. Kristen is able to handle herself in the dreams by way of acrobatic abilities. Joey is someone who has a lot on his mind, but can't seem to articulate it. This inability to speak his mind dovetails quite well into the idea of teenagers being forced to deal with hormones, societal expectations, and the responsibilities of looming adulthood, without having the ability to express how these things are affecting them. And in the end, Joey's decision to spill his feelings via the rage-filled scream acts as a nice character arc, as well as being indicative of volatile teenage feelings. The film begins to explore its darker, more complex intentions by way of the remaining characters. Taryn is a recovering drug addict, struggling to move past her demons, and regardless of her stylized dream powers, Freddy is able to take advantage of her weaknesses and gets the best of her. Failure to live up to the American dream causes many people to become addicted to substances. The character of Taryn and the manner in which she's killed fits in well with this thematic idea. Jennifer has a tendency to self-harm with cigarettes, and has dreams of becoming a Hollywood actress, which is easy for Freddy to take advantage of. Hollywood is famous for not only being the movie capital of the world, but also the land of broken dreams. This American institution's darker nature is one that fits perfectly in line with the film's intentions. Philip's vice is even more complex. He sleepwalks, and sleepwalking could be thought of as being trapped in a perpetual dream fog, while still being able to function in a waking state, but essentially being on autopilot, with little conscious reasoning or ability to break out of the dream cycle. There are lots of people sleepwalking through life, caught in the machinery the American dream demands they participate in, and Philip's predilection for creating puppets couldn't be a more perfect metaphor for this idea. Puppets and their total dependence on whomever is pulling the strings. Will is confined to a wheelchair because of a previous suicide attempt. Role-playing games have become his passion, In his dreams, he has the ability to walk and become a powerful wizard. Role-playing could be thought of as trading one reality for another, presumably as a means of escape. Many people in America try to escape their circumstances by taking on different personas, as a way to escape the painful reality they've been forced to deal with. And not even Will's considerable dream powers can save him from Freddy's wrath. It's worth noting that the characters that survive the movie do so by sticking together, rather than going after Freddy alone. This is an optimistic progression that is pretty much absent in the previous Elm Street movies. I always felt Nightmare 3 was a bit of an outlier in that regard, which is honestly refreshing. Nancy Thompson's presence in the movie is part and parcel with its themes as well. The survivor of the first movie, all grown up. At first, this seems like an optimistic development, especially given the film's thematic angle of broken dreams. Nancy being all grown up and seemingly thriving with a healthy career after the horrific events she endured in the first movie. It suggests hope. But as the movie progresses, it becomes clear that things aren't as rosy as they may seem. Dr. Gordon discovers she is taking a dream suppressant. Presumably dreaming has become too scary for her. In a way, this inability to dream runs parallel to the broken dream angle. In a thematic sense, Nancy is an adult who's given up on her dreams. The optimism her presence once suggested now seems tainted. And this point becomes crystal clear by the end, when she's murdered at the hands of Freddy. The movie makes no bones about making such a profound statement. Nancy is dead. Her father is dead. The American dream is dead. And yet, the remaining characters go on. But their later deaths in the sequel dispels any notion that there is a happy ending for anyone in these movies. It's a horror franchise, and people have to die in order for the studio to sell tickets. Is there any harsher reality than that? If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like and subscribe button, as I'll be posting more content in the future. Thanks for watching.